Annie Lowrey, author of Give People Money, How Universal Basic Income Would End Poverty, Revolutionize Work, and Remake the World. Welcome to the program, Annie.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, let's go through, and I should also, let me just start also by saying that you wrote a piece the other day about our stock buybacks starving the economy. I have that's sort of a ballywick of mine. So I want to, maybe we get to that after our discussion of universal basic income. But let's start with the lowest hanging fruit in terms of the UBI. Well, actually, even before we get to how it would end poverty, just tell us what it is.
Yeah, so it's a really simple idea. So you basically imagine that the government would give everybody something like a Social Security payment. That's just, like the classic UBI idea. The number that people often talk about is sort of $500 or $1,000 a month. And then there's a lot of common variants. So another idea is that the government would provide something called a guaranteed minimum income. So, the government knows pretty well how much you earn through the tax system. So if you fell below, say, the poverty line or 130% of the poverty line, then they would just boost your income up through tax rebates. So those are the kind of two central ideas that people are usually talking about.
And one is a little bit more universal, obviously, than the other. But I guess, what are the implications of one being more or less universal in those two scenarios?
So it's a good question because it sort of depends on what problem you're trying to solve, right? So say that we have a guaranteed minimum income. That's going to be a really effective way to get families out of poverty. It's basically going to say, there's a floor in this country. We're a really rich society. We're not going to let anybody live on $6,000 a year in cash income. We're just not going to do it. But if it's actually universal and everybody's getting it, so rich, poor, you, me, everyone, that's providing kind of a form of social insurance. It's also going to help do things like boost middle-class wages, provide a kind of wage for people who are not in paid work but are still in important work, so doing things like care work if you're taking care of a kid or an elderly relative or parent. And so, the full-fat UBI is sort of a more radical policy with a lot more policy implications. But if you're looking to just end poverty in the richest society that the planet has ever known, you can do it through this more sort of guaranteed minimum policy.
All right. Well, let's address that. I mean, it obviously it ends poverty insofar as, almost definitionally speaking, right? I mean, if you give people the enough money so that they are no longer fall within our definition of poverty, they're no longer in poverty. But what of and I guess maybe we'll work in some of the critiques as we go through these. What of the argument that, so we're going to pay everybody $1,000. Let's go with just the universal one. Everybody's going to get $1,000, and that will take you out of poverty. I guess presumably, if you have 4 people in the family, right, you're going to get $48,000 a year, and that will take you out of poverty. What happens to? Okay, so it's going to put upward pressure on wages. Presumably, it would put upward wages on prices too. No, and would there be like this game of like never catch the rabbit going around the track?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. There are not great studies about UBI itself and inflation. A lot of people have raised this issue. But I think that you can basically, let's forget UBI and let's just imagine that you have a more equitable distribution of income and consumption. So an economy like we had in the late 90s, we had more inflation then, but there are ways to temper inflation, right? Like this is a fiscal policy and you're still going to have monetary policy. And it's probably still a better equilibrium if you just, are still providing more purchasing power to middle income and lower income families. So it's hard for me to see a world in which it literally all just gets eaten up by inflation. It is possible to see a world in which it gets eaten up by things like rents or rising cost of education or healthcare. So so, it's certainly not a silver bullet that like ensures better levels of consumption for everyone, but it does probably help get you there.
Okay. I mean, I can just imagine like, okay, if I own a bodega in a fairly low income area, and I know that all of a sudden every one of my customers now has got an extra $1,000 cash, I don't know what I'm going to do with my prices there. But all right, well, let's move on to how it would revolutionize work.
Yeah. So, there's kind of two ways that I think about this. So one, and I know that this is obviously something that you talk about on your show in extraordinary depth, but between declining unionization rates in the private sector, between a relatively low minimum wage by historical standards, due to increasing concentration among companies in just huge number of sectors of the economy, you've seen this, declining labor share of income for decades now. And so this is kind of one way to make sure that workers are kind of getting their fair share. If you had $1,000 a month to fall back on, it's unlikely or less likely that you would take a job for $8 an hour that was dangerous, degrading, something you wouldn't otherwise do, right? Like you're not going to find a lot of slaughterhouse workers for $8 an hour if you're also providing them with $1,000. So that's one way. And then another way that it's theorized that this could be a good thing is that, we've known for hundreds of years that GDP and national income and national accounting really only accounts for certain types of work, and that's paid work. But there's a huge amount of unpaid labor that's done primarily by women and often by women of color. That's really important to the economy functioning, right? Like somebody needs to be taking care of babies, somebody needs to be taking care of older people, people who might be sick, people with disabilities. And so this is kind of a way of providing a sort of social wage for that kind of work, because we're coming into this, we have an existing child care crisis that's really just, it's driving women out of the labor force. It's sort of difficult for families all over the income scale, which is kind of an interesting thing, although obviously it's much harder for women who are low income or parents who are low income. And then, we have a coming care crisis, one that's probably in a lot of cases already here in terms of elder care. And so, if that work is socially beneficial, but it's hard to make a living doing it, and it's very hard to pay for in some cases, you can imagine that this is sort of a way of addressing that. It's certainly not the only way to address that. But it would probably provide families, and especially low-income families, with more choice to either stay in the labor market or leave, to pay for care or not, and that could be a really good thing.
So broadly speaking, it empowers labor and empowers people to make choices as to where they actually expend effort and work, broadly speaking, work without having to worry about having the ability to make money at it, I guess.
Yeah, ideally, this is a way of providing people with more freedom and more choice. And so, before you were pointing out that there's this kind of technical definition of poverty, right? Like, are you above or below this line? And that's like an important definition, and getting above it is really important. And we know that the simple mathematical fact of getting above it has all sorts of other good beneficial effects on families and kids and people. But, there's this like broader sense in which poverty is about social exclusion. It's about not having choice. And so I think that if you think of this as basically, being a way to provide more choice, more freedom, perhaps even more dignity to people, or at least starting to think about ways to do that. Again, given that we have this amazing, productive, huge economy, but we still have so many folks that are like, wow, I can barely make ends meet, or I'm not making ends meet. But that's the kind of like sort of more powerful philosophical idea that a lot of people have behind it.
Yeah, I mean, I think at one point you referred to it as an ethos.
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, that largely that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. Like on the one hand, this is kind of a technocratic policy fix, And in another hand, we could be talking about, well, okay, is this better than an EITC expansion, or is this better than a child credit, or a universal cash payment of some other kind to some other group of people? And that's all well and good. But I also think that it really, the thing that I find so interesting about it is it just forces you to ask yourself what questions policy could answer and why we don't answer them, right? Like what problems we just leave and we say, well, that's just, that's capitalism, that's a free market, that's our society, that's how we are. And it's not even to say, it's funny because I'm, with some of these questions, I'm not even sure UBI is the best way to address them, but it at least begs the question of how things might be different.
Right. And that's what I find interesting about it too. But before we get to Remake the World, as we cover all of your, the subtitle, let's just address some of the critiques from the right before we get to the critiques from the left. You give people money, and of course, then you've turned the social safety net into a hammock, haven't you?
Yeah, it's a common critique. It's not one that I think holds much water. There is certainly an amount of money that you could give people that they would stop working. That's absolutely true, right? Like, if we gave everybody $150,000 a year from somewhere and made no other changes and prices stayed constant, like I think a lot of people would stop working and would just, enjoy themselves, spend time with their families.
Right, and that would be horrible. Right? I mean, can we just even imagine a world where everyone would enjoy themselves and spend time with their family? That would be a horrible thing to have happen.
Yeah, I know. I'm with you on that, and I certainly hope that the robot apocalypse makes it so that none of us really have to work anymore. I think that would be great. But yeah, look, yes, a UBI. We have studies of this, and it shows that people stop working. Some, not that many. And the people who reduce their work effort, as the literature puts it, or quit working, are often young people who stay in school for longer. They're the parents of young children, and then they are older folks who choose to retire or step back from work a little bit early. It's hard to convince me that those are bad things.
Right. I mean, that's also, it's an arbitrary definition of what we constitute, what we define as work. Right? I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
It's quite possible if I'm going and taking care of my elderly parent, or I'm taking care of my young child, I'm doing work. It's just I'm not being paid for it. I'm certainly doing something that's valuable to society, and something that I could pay someone to do. It's just that when I choose to do it, I'm not getting paid.
Yeah, exactly. And so, and it's hard, right? Like, does that mean that you're going to have a lower employment to population ratio and possibly a lower GDP? Yeah, it does. But those are not really they're not whole measures of welfare, right? Like, it's not capturing everything. So I think that that's important. I would also note that the more punitive measures to get people to work, like work requirements, they tend to speed up how fast people get a job. But there's not a lot of evidence that they get people out of poverty. And in fact, people who can't comply with work requirements who get sanctioned end up in really deep poverty. And so, I understand that there's this argument that the government just wants to encourage human flourishing by getting people into the workforce and keeping them there. And I do think that sort of policies that focus more on carrots than sticks, so like the earned income tax credit, have proven really valuable. But I do think that, our conception of work can change. Even our conception of how to measure the health of our economy and our polity can change. And so, again, I don't see a mom of 3 kids or a dad who wants to be with his parent when his parent is dying. It's such a bad thing for them to stop working.
Well, I mean, if you give them $12,000 a year, they're going to want to do that every time one of their parents are dying. And that's going to be, largely that's what it is, right? I mean, the argument ultimately boils down to someone's sense of morality and literally like idle hands are the devil's plaything. I mean, even if we can argue about whether people are actually idle, that's a data point that is probably measurable if we had the ability to measure that. But ultimately, it's this sort of it's a moral hazard argument, and it's a very specific sense of morality on some level that people are promoting. And I would also add, we never hear it in the context of like wealthy people's kids.
No, never. Nobody is ever like, you know what? We actually want to we want to tax capital income higher because we want people to be wage earners. We want them to be working in that way instead of receiving passive income. Like I've never heard anybody make that argument. I've never heard anybody say we're going to attach work requirements to the mortgage interest deduction, right? Like this is a way in which, we have Puritan roots, right? And it shows up in policies like this. And, I do. And I think you're also right to gesture to this way in which, like, hopefully in the future we could work less, right? Like that would be great if the economy grew in such a way that we had such wealth that we could actually sort of step back a little, which is, other societies have valorized that, right?
That's a way. I've referenced this before on the show, but I bought a steamer trunk years ago at a yard sale outside of Boston, and there was an article from the Miami Herald from like a futurist in the 40s who was giving a talk, I guess, to a ladies' luncheon or something to that effect, but said the real challenge that we were going to have by the end of the century is going to be, what are we going to do with our 4-day work week? Because technology is going to free us all, and we're going to have to the real challenge is going to be figuring out what we do with our downtime. But still waiting for that.
If only.
If only. But all right, so let's talk about the efficacy of just handing people money. And to the extent that we've seen any studies or examples of this around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So low and middle income countries, it's very popular. More than 100 of them have either unconditional cash transfers, so like if you're poor, we just give you money, or conditional ones. The two biggest exemplars of this are the two that sort of started the trend and are pointed to most often, a program called Bolsa Familia and Oportunidades, which are in Mexico and in Brazil. And those are conditional. So basically they say to poor families who are in those countries tend to be a lot poorer than even the poor families here, if you have your kid vaccinated, and if your kid is enrolled in school, then you can receive this transfer money. And so those they work great. They work really well. And we have just study after study after study, both in a low-income country context and in high-income country context, showing that if you just give people cash, they they consume more, which is kind of the idea. But their kind of pattern of consumption doesn't tend to change. So they're not off like gambling and buying alcohol and that kind of thing. They buy more groceries, basically. It just, it makes their lives a little bit easier. And especially in low-income countries, we don't have evidence that it reduces work effort at all, because in those cases, you still are, even with the transfer, facing the issue of, how you just get food on the table in a lot of cases. So yeah, just giving people cash works really well. It's not something that we do outside of Social Security here, because there's that, kind of, again, cultural belief that your Social Security payment is yours and you paid for it and the government doesn't have any right to tell you what to do with it. Obviously, that's I think a little bit of a misunderstanding of the accounting. But for something like food stamps, they're very restrictive, right? Like in some places, this is my favorite example about food stamps. In some places, you have to make sure that you're buying domestically produced cheese. So can you imagine you're a parent who's trying to feed your kid with liquor or food stamps, and you have to look at where the cheese was made because God forbid you don't buy the right cheese. And again, we just have all these kind of restrictive things. And, maybe you do have food stamps or SNAP benefits. Maybe that helps you out. But you're missing your gas payment. You're about to get your electricity turned off. You really need your car fixed. And so that SNAP payment doesn't necessarily help with those problems. The money would be much more valuable to you if it were fungible.
And we should add too that the value of this is stretches to people who I think are involved in more or less, for lack of a better term, the gig economy, where you ride out ebbs and flows. I mean, I think there's been a significant amount of research that one of the problems with poverty is that your money comes in chunks at times, and there are times of the year where you have no money, and other times of the year where you have a little bit more, but you're just paying off bills. This would sort of, I guess, even things out a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. It would help provide it'd be kind of like insurance, right? You're never going to be literally without, and that maybe you won't have to, maybe you're not even consuming that much more, but you don't have to make those sudden trade-offs. You don't have to like sell your car in order to keep your lights on type thing. And that would be great, because I think that you're right that, lower income families are often having the problem of just not having enough money, but they're also facing the problem of that kind of financial fragility. And, especially if your community or your family is lower income, who you're going to go to if all of a sudden you need, $500 or something. And that's just, a constant problem. And again, it's, on these measures of fragility, they just really haven't gotten better in a long time. Again, just like the economy growing quite a bit.
All right, so let's move. I mean, I have wrestled with my feelings about the UBI for some time, and I'm increasingly becoming a little bit nervous about it. So let's move on to some of the critiques maybe that we would hear from the left a little bit, which is the Remake the World part, because some of the concern is on the left that this will end up, and it was conceived in some circles as a replacement for the social safety net. So you don't have economic stabilizers that kick in, maybe like food stamps. Maybe you do it partially, just when, I don't know, GDP drops or unemployment drops, or whatever. But there's a lot of concern that a program like this is going to replace the social safety net, which it seems to me it's almost like it's, during the Trump administration, this has been a great lesson, it seems to me, about programs that have any sort of regulatory reliance on regulatory agencies to set anything, right? Like, so we can see how Trump is able to basically unwind the ACA with a little tweak here and a little tweak there. In fact, it was a Republican congressman who had to beg Trump to salvage the, I think it was the risk adjustment payments recently. And had he not, the private insurance component of Obamacare, and you combine that with what's happening with the navigators, all stuff that is sort of like below the statutory level is, but much of the program's contingent upon this. It seems to me there's a real danger with a UBI that we're going to be in the same situation. We're going to set it for $1,000 a month today, and then Donald Trump will be president, or Tom Cotton will be president, and he'll say, whoa, my labor department says that actually you only need $850, and then we just right. I mean, isn't that the biggest concern about a program like this from the left?
Yeah,
I guess.
Look, I mean, so from the left, I think that I share that concern, and I think that there are a couple other good ones. So yes, if you only have a single lever of policy, then that lever becomes that much more vulnerable, right? At least now, if you're cutting food stamps or hurting the ACA, other policies exist, right? I think that that's a good and a very real concern. And so then, I have some other concerns too. So one is that, depending on what policy you're trying to solve, a UBI is a pretty diffuse policy. So if you're just trying to deal with, wages for the middle class, there might be better ways to tackle that. I also think that there's a way in which a UBI could lead to a reduction in progressivity. If you think like Charles Murray of AEI, who's a libertarian, likes the idea of a UBI in part because it just cuts the safety net and everybody gets the same thing. Where, given our Gini coefficient and everything else, there's a lot of evidence that we actually need more progressive policy. We need more redistribution. A UBI in which everybody's getting the same thing doesn't get you there. So those are all issues. I do think that there are good critiques of this from the left.
And so from, I guess, what is how do you foresee something like this being adopted? I mean, have you sat down and said, here's scenario 1, here's scenario 2, here's scenario 3, and how many of those scenarios are attractive in that regard? I mean, if you are someone who perceives that the problem that we have is not just that we don't provide enough for a basic standard of living for folks, but also that we have this sort of instability that comes from having this radical inequality, and not just inequality in the context of income, but really things like education, things like health.
Yeah.
How many of those scenarios are nerve-wracking if those are your issue sets that you're concerned about?
Yeah. So I think that there's a thin edge of the wedge here, or sort of a tip of the spear, right? So there are smaller scale policies that I think share this ethos that I think are much likelier to become policy that Democrats will focus on, I think, if and when they come back into power. So things like eliminating child poverty through a universal child grant, or even a means-tested child grant, that would be great money for the federal government to spend. That is straightforwardly an investment in the health and education of America's future workers. We have disgusting rates of child poverty in the United States. It's about 22%, whereas Denmark, which is not a richer country than the United States, the rate is 3 or 4%. And so, kids don't vote, right? I'm not sure that's going to get a ton of people to the polls, but that could be a good thing and not crazily expensive, right? Not that I think that we need to worry too much about paying for things, but it's a more marginal policy. Things like expanding the earned income tax credit, which would be great for the middle class, along with supportive policies like raising the minimum wage, requiring employers to provide leave, that would be really, really good. And I do think that you're just seeing a lot more blue sky thinking on the left, obviously, right, from Bernie folks, from people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and also, from the sort of more centrist Democratic politicians that are really rushing to the left, so the Cory Bookers of the world. And so I think that the Overton window is really expanding. The policy that I'm actually most enamored of, and I really wish that somebody would take up, and I love drawing attention to, comes from 3 researchers at the University of Michigan that show with something called a negative income tax, which basically you just give people more money depending on how poor they are. It's kind of a complicated mechanism, but it's an easy sort of idea. We could actually eliminate poverty in the country with no more than we spend on current anti-poverty policies. So this could just become more effective. Even if we just wanted to add that on to other things, it would only cost about $200 billion a year, which, yes, is a lot of money, but compared to the Trump tax cuts, we just
added $70 billion a year in our defense budget, and I don't know if I'm exaggerating, but if there were more than 24 articles written about it, or if anybody wrote about it for more than a week, to add that $70 billion, and the idea that 2.5 times that would get rid of poverty is pretty stunning. Right, we just did that. It's 70 crazy, billion. Right? Like there was more controversy over, I don't know, somebody getting pulled from a soccer game than that $70 billion.
Yeah, exactly. As you point out, the government has a lot of space to spend. It's not a crazy thing to think about. And I think it just points to the fact that there's not political will for this, but I'm hoping that there will be. And that, as people increasingly get fed up and say, hey, we've had, another 9-year recovery, and it's still not feeling better for me, that maybe there is just more space for this kind of thing.
All right.